It was the 20th of August, 1941. The summer air in western Russia carried the smell of smoke and oil. The war on the Eastern Front was still young, but already it had become a monster that devoured men, machines, and cities without mercy. German forces had pushed deep into Soviet territory, crushing resistance and leaving trails of burning villages behind them. The world was watching as Operation Barbarossa swept toward the great city of Leningrad. On the outskirts of a small town called Novoyuchkaz, the morning began quietly. The grass was wet with dew, the distant forest shimmered in the sunlight, and a handful of Soviet soldiers stood beside their armored giant, the KV-1 heavy tank. Its dark steel hull was covered in dust, its barrel still cold from the night air. Inside, 5 men were waking up to another day of war. Senior Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov, their commander, was a man of few words. He had the calm eyes of someone who understood the cost of every order he gave. Born in the Soviet countryside, he knew these landscapes well: the mud, the forests, the narrow roads bordered by swamps. He also knew that his unit was standing on the path of a massive German advance. Far away, the roar of engines broke the stillness. A formation of German Ju-88 bombers passed high above, silver dots against the sky. They were heading north, likely bound for Leningrad. The men inside the tank looked up for a moment, but Kolobanov didn't care about planes today. His war would be fought on the ground, here among the birch trees and swampy meadows. The Soviets had suffered terrible losses in the first months of the invasion. Many of their tanks were destroyed or abandoned, and morale had been shaken. But not Kolobanov. He had something most men didn't experience, and belief in his crew. And he also had one of the best weapons the Red Army possessed, the KV-1. That morning, Kolobanov climbed onto the turret of his tank and looked out over the land. A thin mist floated above the marshes, hiding the road that wound toward Marienburg. The Germans would have to pass through that road to reach Leningrad. To the left and right were swamps where no tank could move. Only one narrow strip of land connected the villages, and it would soon become a death trap. Kolobanov had spent days studying this spot. He knew exactly where the enemy would come from and where they would turn. With his map spread over the turret, he marked the firing zones, the range, and the escape routes. The plan was simple, but deadly. He and his 4 other KV-1s would form an ambush. Once the first and last enemy tanks were destroyed, the rest would be trapped in a steel cage with no way forward and no way back. Inside the tank, the crew prepared their machine. Gunner Andrei Yusov checked the sight and elevation system of the 76mm gun. Loader Nikolai Rodimkov stacked armor-piercing shells in neat rows along the sides. Driver Sergei Evdokimov tested the engine and steering, while radio operator Dmitry Kaiselkov adjusted his headset and prepared the signal codes. They had done this many times before, but today felt different. None of them said it aloud, but they all knew what this mission meant. If they failed, the German column would have a clear path toward Leningrad. If they succeeded, they could delay the enemy long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Kolobanov climbed down into the commander's seat and closed the heavy hatch above him. The metal clanged shut, sealing them inside the dark interior lit only by the glow of instruments. The air smelled of oil and metal. He gave a short command. Engines rumbled to life. One by one, the 5 KV-1s rolled into their hidden positions. The commander's tank, number 864, was moved into a shallow pit they had dug during the night. Its hull was buried, leaving only the turret visible above the ground. Branches and grass were spread over it to break the outline. From a distance, it looked like part of the landscape. Kolobanov checked the view through his periscope. Ahead lay the narrow road. On both sides of it, muddy swamps shimmered like mirrors in the morning light. No German tank would survive if it left the road. The trap was ready. The men settled into silence. Hours passed. The only sounds were the creaks of the tank and the soft buzz of insects outside. The sun climbed higher, turning the mist into a bright haze. At times they could hear the faint thunder of distant artillery, a reminder that war was never far away. Kolobanov kept his eyes on the horizon. Every so often he looked at his watch. The Germans were late, but he knew they would come. The road was the only way forward, and the Panzer divisions were moving fast. Inside the tank, the tension grew. Yusov adjusted his sight again. The loader checked the ammunition for the 10th time. Even the hum of the engine seemed louder now. They all waited for that one moment, the first sound of tracks on the road. As the afternoon sun began to burn the fields golden, the distant rumble finally came. It was faint at first, like thunder rolling through the earth. Then it grew louder. Through the periscope, Kolobanov saw movement, tiny specks on the horizon, growing larger. Motorcycles. German scouts. He held his breath as the motorcycles approached, kicking up trails of dust. They stopped near the bend, scanned the area, then turned left and disappeared down the road. The ambush remained silent. These were not the targets Kolobanov was waiting for. Minutes later, the ground began to tremble again. The sound this time was heavier, slower, rhythmic. The clanking of metal, the grinding of gears, the sound every tanker could recognize instantly tracks on steel. The Germans were coming. Kolobanov leaned closer to the scope. Through the dust, he saw them. The first Panzer appeared, followed by another and another. A column of tanks stretching down the road, their armor shining in the sunlight. 22 German tanks and 2 anti-tank guns, all moving straight into his trap. He gave no command yet. Patience was everything. He let them come closer, watched the first tank reach the turn in the road. It slowed down to make the bend, just as he had predicted. Kolobanov raised his hand slightly toward the gunner. The crew held their breath. The war that had ravaged so many towns and taken so many lives was now condensed into a single moment, in a single field, on a single road. 5 Soviet tanks against an entire German column. The world above was silent, but deep underground, in the shadowed hull of tank number 864, the calm before the storm was about to end. Inside the steel belly of the KV-1, 5 men shared a space barely larger than a small room. The walls were thick slabs of armor, designed to keep death out for as long as possible. Every surface was hot to the touch, every sound echoed in the cramped metal shell. Yet this was home for Kolobanov's crew. They trusted this machine as much as they trusted one another. The KV-1 was not a beautiful tank, but it was a terrifying one. Its armor was so thick that most German shells of the time bounced off like stones against a fortress wall. Its 76mm cannon could pierce through enemy tanks at ranges where their own guns were useless. At this point in the war, it was one of the few Soviet designs that could truly stand against the German panzer divisions. Kolobanov knew this. He had studied the German tactics, how they advanced in long columns, relying on speed and coordination rather than armor. The KV-1's strength was not in speed, it was in power and protection. That was why his plan depended on holding position and forcing the Germans into a trap where they could not maneuver. His crew understood this too. Each man had his role, and each role could mean the difference between life and death. At the gunner's seat sat Andrei Yusov, a man in his late 20s with steady hands and sharp eyes. He had been a hunter before the war and treated every target with the same calm patience. His world now existed through the narrow circle of a gun sight, where every second mattered. Next to him was Nikolai Rodenkov, the loader. His job was the most exhausting, lifting heavy shells again and again, feeding them into the gun's breech as fast as possible. He barely spoke, but his rhythm was perfect, like a machine built for war. At the front sat Sergei Evdokimov, the driver. He was the youngest of them all, barely 20 years old, his hands constantly smeared with grease. Sergei had grown up fixing tractors, and now he handled the KV-1's 26-ton weight with surprising grace. He knew how to make the tank move quietly, how to dig it into the ground, and how to reverse it in seconds when needed. Behind him, at the radio station, sat Dmitry Kyselkov, the operator and machine gunner. His radio was their only link to the other 4 KV-1s spread across the countryside. He also manned the front-mounted machine gun, ready to cover the infantry or shoot at any German who dared come too close. And finally, standing above them all, was Senior Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov, commander, strategist, and the man responsible for their lives. He had been a tanker since before the war, respected by his men for his coolness under pressure. To him, a tank was not just a weapon. It was a tool of timing and intelligence. He once told his men, "A tank battle is not about who fires first, but who fires last." That philosophy guided everything he did. He was not reckless, not eager for glory. He simply understood that if he placed his men and his machines correctly, even 5 tanks could hold back an army. As the KV-1 sat in silence overlooking the road, Kolobanov replayed the plan in his mind. His other 4 tanks were positioned like a web around the nearby crossroads, each with a clear field of fire but strict orders not to shoot until he gave the signal. Their task was to protect his flanks and finish the battle once his own tank began the ambush. Kolobanov knew the risks. If the Germans discovered their positions too early, the element of surprise would be lost. If they advanced with heavy artillery support, the KV-1s could be in serious danger. But the terrain was perfect. The swamps on both sides of the road left the Germans with no room to move. They would have to come straight down the narrow strip, just as he wanted. The tank was quiet now, except for the low hum of the idling engine. Yusuf's hands rested on the elevation controls. Rodenkov wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Kaiselkopf adjusted the radio knob, catching static from the other positions. Kolobanov leaned forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on the periscope. The Germans were close now. Through the scope, dust rose from the approaching convoy. The silhouettes of the first Panzers appeared clearly. The road shimmered under the sun like a ribbon of light. Kolobanov felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his chest. He had seen war enough to know how quickly things could go wrong. Yet he also felt something else, a deep, unshakable calm. This was his battlefield. He had chosen it, shaped it, and now he would fight for it. He remembered his orders from command earlier that morning. Hold the line at all costs. It sounded simple on paper, but out here, holding the line meant standing between an unstoppable machine and a burning city. Through the narrow slit of the periscope, Kolobanov watched the German column snake its way along the road. The first tank was a light Panzer, likely a Panzer 35 or 38, with thin armor and a small gun. Behind it came the heavier Panzer IVs. They were still no match for his KV-1, but there were many of them too many. "Steady," he said quietly. Inside the tank, time seemed to slow. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of the crew and the grinding of the German tracks outside. The first Panzer reached the bend in the road. It slowed down, just as he had calculated. "Range 800 meters, Yusuf whispered. Kolobanov nodded. "Wait for my signal." He wanted the entire column to enter the kill zone. The road had to be full before they struck. One tank destroyed too early, and the rest might escape. The KV-1's engine growled faintly as the driver adjusted position. The gun turned ever so slightly, its barrel aimed at the front of the column. Sweat rolled down the men's faces. They could see the enemy now, clearly, moving through the golden light. 22 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and dozens of German soldiers riding alongside. None of them had any idea what waited ahead. Kolobanov looked once more at his crew: Yusuf, Rodenkov, Evdokimov, and Kaiselkopf. He saw no fear in their eyes, only focus. These men were not here for glory or revenge. They were here because someone had to stand between the invader and their home. He exhaled slowly. His gloved hand rested on the back of the gunner's seat. Then, when the lead tank reached the perfect spot on the turn, he gave a single order that cut through the silence. "Fire." The thunder of the cannon filled the cramped interior, and the war truly began. The first shell screamed across the still Russian countryside. It flew low over the golden fields and slammed into the lead German tank with a flash that lit up the air. The explosion echoed through the valley, followed by a deep roar as the Panzer burst into flames. Smoke and fire poured out of its turret. The tank stopped dead at the turn in the road. Inside Kolobanov's KV-1, no one cheered. They had no time. The loader, Rodenkov, already had another shell in his hands. He slammed it into the breach, his movements sharp and automatic. "Loaded," he shouted. "Next target," said Kolobanov. Through his scope, Yusuf found the second tank in line. Another flash, another boom. The shell hit squarely, tearing through armor and setting off ammunition inside. The second Panzer exploded, its turret lifting slightly before falling sideways into the ditch. The Germans were confused at first. To them, it seemed like mines or artillery. The column came to a stop. Engines revved, officers shouted orders, and the rest of the tanks began to bunch together. In moments, the narrow road was blocked. Kolobanov gave a short command. "Rear tank. Take it out." The KV-1's gun thundered again. This time, the shell flew past the burning wrecks at the front and slammed into the last tank at the far end of the line. A perfect hit. Fire erupted from the back of the column, trapping every tank in between. Now the Germans were panicking. They had nowhere to go. The road was a narrow corridor, and the swamp on both sides swallowed anything that tried to leave the solid ground. One tank tried anyway, its tracks sinking deep into the soft earth until it tilted helplessly to one side. Inside Kolobanov's tank, the heat and noise were unbearable. Each shot shook the steel floor, each reload sent vibrations through the crew's boots. But they kept their rhythm. The loader worked like a machine. The gunner's breathing stayed calm, controlled. Outside, chaos grew. German officers waved their pistols, trying to organize their men. The tanks fired wildly at distant shapes, believing the Russians were hidden among haystacks and barns. Bullets tore through the countryside, setting small fires. Kolobanov watched it all through his narrow periscope. He saw the confusion spreading, the fear taking hold. The Germans had no idea where the fire was coming from. That was exactly how he wanted it. He turned to the radio operator. "Signal to the others. Hold position. Do not fire yet." Kaiselkopf tapped the code into the transmitter. The other 4 KV-1s stayed silent in their hidden positions. They were ghosts on the battlefield. Kolobanov wanted the Germans to think there was only one attacker. "Loader, armor-piercing," Kolobanov said. "Loaded. Fire." Another deafening blast shook the ground. The 3rd German tank went up in smoke. A 4th followed moments later. Now the return fire began in earnest. The German gunners finally spotted flashes of light on the ridge and turned their cannons toward the distant rise. Shells began to land around Kolobanov's position, exploding in bursts of dirt and flame. Inside the KV-1, each impact sounded like a hammer hitting a giant bell. The tank rocked with every hit, but the thick armor held. Sparks flew inside the turret as fragments of metal rattled off the walls. "Hit on the side," shouted the driver. "No damage," Kolobanov replied. "Stay calm. Keep firing." They had trained for this moment, and their discipline showed. Every command was short. Every movement was precise. Rodenkopf loaded. Yusov fired. Kaiselkopf relayed positions. Evdokimov adjusted the tank's aim using the steering controls. One after another, the German tanks burned. Black smoke coiled into the sky, mixing with the smell of oil and gunpowder. From a distance, it looked like the whole road was on fire. Kolobanov had positioned his tank perfectly. The Germans could not hit his hull because most of it was buried in the ground. Only the turret was exposed, wrapped in branches and mud. Even when they saw where the shots were coming from, their shells bounced harmlessly off the thick armor. Minutes turned into an hour. The battle became a duel between one Soviet tank and an entire column of German armor. The KV-1's gun roared again and again, its barrel glowing faintly from the heat, and a violent clang echoed inside as a shell struck the turret directly. Dust and paint fell from the ceiling. The men froze for a second, then heard the sound they were waiting for the ricochet. The shell had bounced off. "Still alive," muttered Yusov. Kolobanov smiled slightly. "Then keep it that way." Outside, the Germans brought in their anti-tank guns. They were smaller but deadly at close range. 2 guns were pushed into position at the edge of the road. The first managed to fire once, sending a shot that whistled past the KV-1's turret. Before it could fire again, Yusov aimed and destroyed it with a single return shot. The second gun followed a moment later, shattered by a direct hit. Inside, sweat ran down their faces. The air was thick with smoke from the gunpowder. Every reload was harder than the last. Their arms ached, their ears rang. But no one complained. They were winning, and they knew it. Kolobanov's crew was down to their last few shells when another blast shook the tank. This one hit the periscope directly, shattering the glass. "Scope's gone," shouted Yusov. Kolobanov didn't hesitate. "Reverse out. We'll fix it." The driver backed the tank down the slope, grinding through mud and debris. Outside, under fire, radio operator Kaiselkopf climbed out to replace the damaged site. Shells exploded nearby, throwing dirt and smoke around him, but he kept working until the scope was replaced. He climbed back in, covered in dust, breathing hard. The turret was damaged too. It no longer rotated smoothly, but Kolobanov refused to stop. "We'll use the steering to aim," he said. Now, instead of turning the turret, Evdokimov maneuvered the entire tank to line up new shots. It was slower, but it worked. The KV-1 kept firing. By late afternoon, the German advance had completely stopped. The once proud column was now a graveyard of twisted steel. The Germans had tried everything: tanks, guns, even infantry with grenades, but nothing could break through the KV-1's armor. Kolobanov took a moment to look through the scope at the devastation. The road was littered with wrecks, smoke rising in every direction. His crew had fired nearly all their ammunition. 22 tanks and 2 anti-tank guns lay destroyed. He reached for the radio. "All tanks," he said calmly, "open fire." From the surrounding hills, the other 4 KV-1s finally revealed themselves. Their guns thundered in unison, raining shells on the remaining German forces. The echoes rolled across the swamps like thunder. The battle that had begun as a quiet ambush had turned into a storm of fire and iron. The Germans, once confident and unstoppable, now fled through fields of smoke and burning wrecks. Kolobanov's crew sat in silence. The air inside the tank was hot and heavy. The battle was over, but the memory of it would never leave them. They had faced overwhelming odds and survived. And though their tank bore the marks of 156 hits, not a single shell had pierced its armor. The trap had worked perfectly. The roar of engines faded, replaced by the crackle of burning metal and the groan of collapsing turrets. The smell of fuel, smoke, and scorched rubber filled the air. Across the narrow road that wound through the swamp, black columns of smoke rose into the bright afternoon sky. Inside tank number 864, Kolobanov and his crew sat in the half-darkness, drenched in sweat, their ears ringing from the thunder that had shaken their world. For nearly 2 hours they had fought alone one heavy tank against an entire column of German armor, and now the battlefield lay silent, except for the distant hiss of flames. "Count the rounds left," Kolobanov ordered quietly. Rodenkopf checked the racks. "Only 2 shells, Comrade Lieutenant." Kolobanov nodded. "Then we save them. No waste." He leaned over the periscope. The smoke outside was thick, drifting like fog over the wrecks. Flames reflected on pools of oily water that ran across the road. Here and there, small explosions popped as ammunition inside the destroyed Panzers cooked off. The silence after so much noise was almost haunting. Even the birds had fled. Yusuf wiped soot from his face. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. "That's 22 tanks," he said quietly, almost in disbelief. Kolobanov didn't answer. He just kept scanning the horizon. There was no sign of more enemy movement, not yet. But he knew the Germans would not leave it at this. Reinforcements would come. They always did. The radio crackled softly. "Commander," came a voice, "we see your smoke. Orders?" It was the leader of one of the other KV-1 crews hidden nearby. Kolobanov pressed the transmitter. "Move in. Target remaining vehicles and infantry. Fire at will." The calm words unleashed another storm. From hidden positions around the fields, the other 4 KV-1s opened fire. Their shells streaked through the smoke, smashing into the last German vehicles still trying to turn or retreat. The echoes rolled through the forest, deep and thunderous. Kolobanov's crew watched from their position as the last of the enemy formation broke apart. Some German soldiers ran into the marshes, where the mud swallowed them up to their knees. Others abandoned their vehicles and fled down the road, disappearing into the haze. By the time the Soviet tanks ceased fire, the road was unrecognizable. It looked like the aftermath of a storm that had torn through steel and flesh alike. Kolobanov finally removed his headset and leaned back against the metal wall. The inside of the KV-1 was filled with smoke and the sharp scent of gunpowder. The crew was silent. Their faces were blackened, their uniforms stained with sweat and oil. After a long pause, he spoke. "Good work, comrades. We held them." For the first time since dawn, a hint of a smile crossed the men's faces. Yusuf closed his eyes and rested his hands on the gun barrel. Rodenkopf slumped against the wall, breathing hard. The driver, Evdokimov, reached for his canteen and passed it around. Outside, the battlefield still burned. The flames reflected on the KV-1's armor, painting it in shades of orange and red. It looked less like a tank and more like a creature of iron that had survived the fire. After a while, Kolobanov climbed up through the hatch. The heat outside hit him immediately, heavy and dry. He stood on the turret, scanning the horizon. The air was thick with the smell of destruction. All around him, the landscape was littered with smoking wrecks, blackened hulks of what had once been the pride of Germany's Panzer divisions. He could hardly believe it himself. 22 tanks destroyed by one crew, and not a single loss among them. He looked down at his own machine. The armor was scarred and dented. He counted some of the mark's deep craters where shells had struck and bounced off. Later they would count 156 impacts in total, but none had gone through. Kolobanov ran his hand over the warm steel of the turret. "Good work, old friend," he murmured. It was strange to feel affection for a machine, but after what they had been through, the KV-1 felt alive, a partner that had shielded them through the storm. In the distance, he could hear engines approaching, his own reinforcements. The other 4 KV-1s rolled down from the hills, their engines growling. Soldiers from the local infantry unit followed on foot, wide-eyed as they looked at the devastation before them. When they reached Kolobanov, they could hardly believe what they saw. The entire road was covered in wreckage, a solid line of burned-out tanks from one end to the other. "Tank Alley," one of them whispered. The name would stay forever. Kolobanov climbed down from his turret as his men emerged from the hatches. Their uniforms were torn, their faces smeared with soot, but their eyes were bright. They had done what no one thought possible. A young infantry officer approached and saluted. "Comrade Lieutenant, this is unbelievable. Did you really destroy them all?" Kolobanov shrugged lightly. "We did what we were trained to do." He didn't speak of heroism or victory. He just looked back at the smouldering horizon, knowing that this was only one battle in a much larger war. Leningrad still needed defending. The Germans would come again in greater numbers and with heavier weapons. But for now, on this quiet stretch of land near Novodevichy, the Red Army had won a moment of peace. As evening fell, a light softened over the battlefield. The smoke turned grey, rising slowly into the calm sky. Kolobanov and his crew sat on the grass beside their tank, eating from their ration tins. None of them spoke much. They didn't need to. The silence between them carried more meaning than words ever could. In the distance, the setting sun turned the wrecks into dark silhouettes against the orange sky. The reflection of the fire danced on the swamp water. It looked both beautiful and terrible, a reminder of what war does to men and machines alike. Kolobanov looked around at his crew. They were young, tired, and covered in soot, but they were alive. He thought of their families, their homes, the city far to the north that still stood because of their stand today. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel something close to pride. Then he stood up and gave the order to check the tank again. There would be no rest for long. The KV-1 would need repairs, new shells, and fuel. Tomorrow, the war would continue. But the legend of this day had already been written: a single Soviet tank that stopped an entire German column and turned a narrow road in the Russian countryside into a symbol of courage. The world would later call it one of the greatest armoured ambushes in history. To Kolobanov and his men, it was just their duty. And as night fell over Tank Alley, the last embers faded into the dark, leaving behind only silence, the smell of smoke, and the quiet heartbeat of a nation that refused to surrender. Night fell over the countryside, but for Kolobanov and his men, the echoes of the battle still lived inside their minds. The roar of cannons, the metallic clank of shells striking steel, the trembling of the ground, these sounds did not fade easily. Even in silence, the tank seemed to hum with the memory of war. Inside the KV-1, the crew began to clean and inspect their equipment. Every lever, every shell rack, every piece of the gun was checked carefully. Smoke residue coated the interior. The metal smelled like oil and sweat. Outside, the other Soviet crews were moving among the wrecks, collecting what they could from the destroyed German vehicles' maps, ammunition, even food. The battlefield was both a graveyard and a supply depot. Kolobanov stood outside his tank, flashlight in hand, inspecting the turret. Its surface looked like a cratered moon. Dents, burn marks, and twisted edges covered it. He counted one after another, each one a reminder of how close death had come. 156 hits, none of them fatal. The KV-1 had proven itself to be nearly indestructible. He called his men over. "You see this armor?" he said quietly, tapping the steel with his gloved hand. "This is what saved us today. But remember, it was not just the tank. It was discipline. It was patience. It was the plan." They listened in silence. These were not words of pride, but of warning. War had a cruel habit of turning success into overconfidence. Yusuf the gunner looked out at the horizon. "Do you think they'll come again?" he asked. Kolobanov nodded. "They always come again." He was right. The German army did not retreat easily. Even as the men rested beside their tanks, reports arrived over the radio. Reconnaissance planes had been spotted. New armoured columns were moving north. The fight for Leningrad was far from over. Kolobanov gathered his men around the campfire. Their faces were lit by the soft glow of the flames. The surrounding fields were dark, except for the faint shimmer of smoke rising from the wrecks. The night air was cool now, carrying the sound of frogs and crickets from the swamps. "Today we stopped them," Kolobanov said, his voice calm. "But remember this, what we did was not luck. We chose the ground. We stayed hidden. We waited until the right moment. That is how a small force defeats a large one." He looked around at the faces of his crew, tired but proud. Each man had performed his role perfectly. and yet he could see in their eyes that none of them truly believed they would live through many more battles like this. When dawn broke, the field looked different. The fires had burned out, leaving black shapes against the pale mist. Birds had returned, circling above the wrecks. Soviet infantry units arrived to secure the area. They walked among the remains of the German tanks with a mix of awe and disbelief. One soldier stopped to take a closer look at the lead Panzer. Its front plate was torn open like paper. "How many did you destroy?" he asked one of Kolobanov's crew. 22, came the quiet answer. The man whistled softly. "With one tank." The crew didn't reply. There was no need. The proof was lying all around them. Later that morning, a Soviet field officer arrived to inspect the site. He shook Kolobanov's hand firmly. "Comrade Senior Lieutenant," he said, "you and your men have done the impossible. Moscow will hear about this." Kolobanov saluted. "We were only doing our duty, sir." But as the officer looked at the smoking road that now stretched from one horizon to the other, he realized that this was not an ordinary battle. This was something that would be remembered. The men were ordered to rest. Engineers came to tow the damaged KV-1 back for repairs, though Kolobanov insisted it was still fit to fight. Its armor was bruised, its turret stiff, but it remained a living fortress. As they waited for the tow vehicles, the crew sat together under the shade of a broken tree. The morning sun was bright, glinting off the blackened steel of the destroyed Panzers. The air smelled faintly of ash and oil. Yusuf ran a hand over his gunner's scope, now repaired and clear. "It's strange," he said softly. "During the battle, I didn't feel fear, not once. But now, thinking about it, I can't stop shaking." Kolobanov looked at him and nodded slowly. "Fear doesn't come during the fight," he said. "It comes after. That's when you realize what could have happened." The others nodded in agreement. They all knew it was true. During the battle, there had been no time for emotion. Only focus. Only instinct. Now, in the calm that followed, their hands trembled from the weight of it all. In the distance, the sound of engines grew louder, friendly tanks moving forward to take up new positions. The war machine rolled on. Kolobanov climbed once more onto the turret of his KV-1 and looked out toward the north. The land stretched flat and endless, dotted with birch trees and pools of water. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the German army was regrouping, preparing for its next push. He took a deep breath. The air was cool and sharp. The battle of the previous day would go down in history, but for him it was already in the past. What mattered now was the next fight. He turned to his men. "Get some rest. When we move again, we move as one. The Germans will not forget this road. Neither should we." The crew nodded. Some lay down beside the tank, others cleaned their weapons. The sound of the wind brushed through the tall grass, and for a brief moment the front was quiet. But even in that silence, the echo of gunfire still lingered in their memories, a reminder that in the heart of every soldier who survives such a day, the battle never truly ends. As the sun rose higher, its light fell upon the road now known as Tank Alley. The wrecks shimmered in the heat, silent monuments to a day when courage and precision triumphed against impossible odds. The KV-1 stood nearby, its armor gleaming under the sun, dented but undefeated. And somewhere deep inside that tank, behind the scars and the smoke, lived the spirit of 5 men who refused to give up their ground no matter the cost. Days passed, but the memory of the battle at Novouchkaz refused to fade. The road still smelled of oil and smoke. The burned-out skeletons of German tanks stood as black monuments in the quiet countryside. Villagers who passed by would stop, whispering to one another as they looked at the line of wrecks stretching across the swampy plain. They did not yet know that this place would soon earn a name, Tank Alley, a symbol of courage that would echo across generations. For Kolobanov and his men, the victory brought little rest. The KV-1 was towed back to base for inspection, its once smooth armor now scarred and pitted. Engineers gathered around it in amazement, touching the dents and shaking their heads. One of them said quietly, "It looks like it fought the entire German army by itself." In truth, it nearly had. 156 hits, not one penetration, 22 German tanks and 2 anti-tank guns destroyed by a single crew in a single day. When word reached headquarters, disbelief spread first, then pride. Reports were sent up the chain of command, and soon the story of Kolobanov's ambush reached Moscow. It was hailed as one of the greatest feats of tank warfare in the early days of the war. Newspapers would later print it as proof that the Red Army still stood strong, that even in the darkest moments, its soldiers could outthink and outfight the invader. But for Kolobanov, there was no celebration, no parades, no grand speeches. He and his men were simple soldiers, and they returned to duty as soon as their tank was repaired. There were other battles waiting, other roads to defend. Still, among those who fought beside them, the tale spread quickly. In the evenings, around campfires and makeshift barracks, soldiers spoke of the 5 men in tank number 864. They spoke of how they turned the swampy road into a death trap, how their gun roared again and again, and how their steel fortress stood unharmed when the smoke cleared. Kolobanov's crew became legends not because they sought glory, but because they refused to retreat. Weeks later, when Kolobanov was called to headquarters, his superiors asked him to recount the battle. He described it plainly, without exaggeration. He spoke of the planning, the positioning, the calm before the first shot, and how each member of his crew performed their role with precision. When the officer listening to him asked what he felt during those hours, Kolobanov paused for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I did not feel fear, only focus. The fear came later when I realized we were still alive." His words were recorded in the official report, but they never captured the full truth, the pounding of his heart, the heat of the metal, the smell of gunpowder and burning steel, the way silence fell after the last gun fired. These things could not be written in any report. Kolobanov was later awarded the Order of the Red Banner for his actions, one of the highest military honors in the Soviet Union. Yet even that recognition came with modest ceremony. He wore the medal quietly, without boasting, knowing that medals did not bring back the lives lost elsewhere. Years later, after the war, when the world had changed and the guns had gone silent, Zinovy Kolobanov returned to civilian life. He rarely spoke about that day, though those who knew him said his eyes would sometimes drift far away, as if he were watching the battlefield again, the line of tanks, the smoke, the burning sky. The war had taken much from him, as it had from all who lived through it. But it had also given him something, a bond with his men that could never be broken, and the knowledge that on one August afternoon they had changed the course of history in their small corner of the world. The road near Novyechkaz still exists today. The swamps are quieter now, the grass has grown tall over the scars of war, and the villages have been rebuilt. Yet if you walk there in the evening light, you can still see the faint outlines where the tanks once stood. Local children ride their bicycles along the old dirt road without knowing that 80 years ago, fire and thunder filled this same stretch of land. A small monument now stands there, a single KV-1 tank raised on a stone platform. Its gun points down the same road where the German column once advanced. The inscription reads simply, "Here, Senior Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov and his crew halted the enemy's advance. August 20th, 1941. Every year on that day, people gather to lay flowers at its base. Veterans in old uniforms salute the tank. Children wave small flags. The wind rustles through the birch trees, carrying with it the faint echoes of a distant battle. It is said that if you stand quietly there, just before sunset, you can almost hear the deep rumble of engines beneath the ground, the sound of the KV-1 rising again from the earth, ready to defend its land one more time. And in that silence, you realize what this story has always been about. Not just steel and strategy, not just numbers and explosions. It is about courage, the kind that does not shout, but endures. The courage to hold your ground when retreat seems easier. The courage to believe that one stand on one forgotten road can make a difference. Zinovy Kolobanov and his men proved that day that courage, preparation, and unity can overcome even the greatest odds. Their battle was not fought for medals or headlines. It was fought for the soil beneath their feet, for the people behind them, and for the simple belief that no invader could take away their home without a fight. As the sun sets over Tank Alley, its rays gleam across the turret of the old KV-1, now silent but unbroken. And somewhere, in the hearts of those who remember, the voice of Kolobanov still whispers through the wind, calm, steady, unshaken. Hold the line.